In today's video, we have several updates, including the latest on the NHL Hub Cities and CBA talks. Plus, we have some offseason rumors focusing on the Blues and the Senators. And could the San Jose Sharks emerge as a contender should the Sabres decide to trade their top star Jack Eichel? We'll discuss all that coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, we have several things to discuss today. First up, though, on the agenda is all the updates regarding the Hub Cities and return to play and all the other things that comes with that right now. Currently, the latest updates indicate that we very well might have the NHL Playoffs is what we're going to call a Made in Canada event, where more than likely things are leaning closer and closer that Toronto and Edmonton could both host the NHL Hub Cities here for the playoffs, with Toronto doing the Eastern Conference and Edmonton doing the Western Conference. That's the latest, and we've seen that from a number of NHL sources this evening, indicating that there's a lot of concern with the rising COVID-19 cases in Vegas and many other areas of the U.S., and that right now the rates in Canada are much lower, and that's what things are looking at. Of course, we don't have an announcement yet. It's a very fluid situation, and until things are announced, things could change. But as of the last reports, that's how things are looking. Wouldn't be shocking if tomorrow being Canada Day that we actually get an announcement tomorrow. But I think part of the reason why we don't have an announcement on the Hub Cities is they're so focused right now on getting a CBA extension in place, as well as phase 3 and 4 protocols agreed to. Those are much more pressing, I think, at the moment. It looks as though they kind of would prefer, if they can, to make one big announcement with all these details all together. That seems to be the preference at the moment. But it looks as though from the CBA standpoint, as I mentioned yesterday and the last couple of times we've talked about this, right now it looks as though they have a plan in place to kind of keep escrow down. Obviously it's going to be up a little bit here for a year or two, but it's capped, and then it's going to go down from there after the next couple of years. The salary cap's going to remain flat for a couple of years, and then likely start to slowly creep up there as well. And Elliot Friedman's reporting this evening that it looks as though there is a pretty good chance, in his opinion, that the NHL players will be going to at least the next Olympics, possibly the next two. Of course, there's more negotiations involved to kind of finalize those details, but it's going to depend on how long the extension is for the CBA here as well. But like I said, it's rumored to be a 4-year extension. There's 2 years left, so we'd have labor peace for 6 years. So obviously there would be one Olympic Games in that time frame for sure, but there could be an agreement for a second one in there as well. We'll have to wait and see, but there's all kinds of things. But one of the more pressing issues with all that is signing bonuses. Those are technically due tomorrow, and there's over $300 million in NHL signing bonuses due to be paid out to players on July the 1st. Many feel that there's likely going to be an agreement to have that deferred or pushed back by anywhere from 60 to 120 days, so 2 to 3 or 4 months, somewhere along those lines, which could very well put it in the fall, which would make sense, because if the NHL season's expecting to be wrapped up around end of September, 1st of October, then obviously October and probably into the first part of November would be when they'd have free agency, and that would be normally when these bonuses would be paid out during that time frame. So obviously we don't know if that's agreed to yet, but if it's not agreed to by tomorrow, then technically the owners are on the hook to pay us that money unless there's something in place. Another note as well is it doesn't look like there's been any mention so far about compliance buyouts being included at all, so I don't expect teams are going to have those to be able to move out some high-priced contracts. But clearly with the cap staying flat for some time, that's going to cause problems, especially many of the teams that are considered top contenders and top performing teams right now. Obviously with the Seattle expansion draft coming through here in the not too distant future, wouldn't be surprising if we see some bigger ticket contracts of players available that you might not have expected before, just with the possibilities here that obviously teams are going to be so strapped that they might not have any choice but to do so. And even if these players can't be traded and they can't be bought out, maybe that's a way out. So we'll have to see how that impacts things, but clearly it certainly would be nice for some teams to have that, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen. There's also conflicting reports out there about players that were newly signed, whether or not they'd be allowed to play or not. I mean, previously, based on the old rules, a player would have been able to sign, say, in March and still play out the rest of the year and possibly into the playoffs. So we're looking at guys like Alexander Romanov in Montreal, Kaprizov in Minnesota, players who want to sign and get into the NHL for the 1920 season, but the NHL did change that so they weren't going to be allowed to do so. And that's something that the NHL Players Association was really bargaining hard for to get changed. And I've seen reports indicating it going both ways here. So again, that part is not quite clear on where things stand with that during these negotiations. So that's all the latest on the NHL return to play, but it would not be surprising at all with tomorrow being July 1st, which is also Canada Day, that I would not be surprised to see an announcement tomorrow. But it's expected that the NHL and the PA are going to be working hard through the night to resolve many of these issues as they can and see if they can't come to an agreement here on all the stuff that get an announcement here in short order. Now, as I mentioned as well, we also have some offseason rumors I want to take a look at. First up, let's get started with the Ottawa Senators. Many NHL insiders feel the Ottawa Senators will be an incredibly busy team as we approach the 2020 NHL Draft. As we talked about here in the past couple of days since the draft lottery, I would imagine that the picks number 3 and 5 that the Senators have likely don't get moved. The only possibility I think with that would be that if Pierre Dorion wants to explore the possibility of moving up, then maybe that could be had, but it's going to be a difficult trade to do. Or maybe, like I said, depending on who they want and who Detroit wants at 4, maybe they work out a deal to move back one spot and go 4-5. Detroit goes 3 and get an extra asset or something to that effect. But that's about it, really. But otherwise, when we get to the actual draft, I expect Ottawa to be incredibly busy. They also have a third first rounder that they're likely getting from the New York Islanders, barring the fact that they don't win the draft lottery for first overall, which means they'd have to lose their first round qualifying matchup here as well. So if the Islanders lose and win the draft lottery, that's the only scenario that would prevent the Senators from getting that pick. And then they also have 4 second-round picks, so they have 7 picks in the first 2 rounds. That's an incredibly large number, and I don't imagine Pierre Dorion is going to be hanging on to all of those. They could possibly move the packages together to try to move up to get some of those picks a little bit higher, or they could try to acquire some other NHL-ready talent. NHL teams are going to be very tight on cap space, as we've already talked about, which means that especially some of these younger RFAs that are looking for some bigger money, they may not be able to get that from their existing teams, and Dorion might be able to exploit that, kind of weaponize his cap space that he's been hoarding here over the last few years to try to make some acquisitions from some of these young players who could jump into their lineup and be a good help. I mean, the Senators have a pretty deep prospect pool, but if they can get a player or two that's already NHL ready, then that certainly could be something they could easily do without too much assets going out the door. Now, some of that cap space is going to get used up because they have to sign guys like Connor Brown and Anthony Duclair. They likely sign Chris Tierney. I would think they probably give a short-term deal to Mark Borieski on the back end as well. I don't expect him to really dip into free agency a whole heck of a lot. I'm not sure about guys like Ron Hainsey or Craig Anderson. I'd be surprised if they come back, but you just never know. I guess there's a lot to uncertainty there. I would think Anderson's likely done. Hainsey maybe on a 1-year deal, but really not sure about that either. So Ottawa likely is going to be very busy, but most of their dealings likely going to happen at the draft. Now, when it comes to the St. Louis Blues, they're a little bit of a different story, but it wouldn't be surprising to see a draft day deal, perhaps. Obviously, a lot of talk in a recent St. Louis Blues article about how they can keep their captain, Alex Pietrangelo, and if that might force them to trade Justin Falk. Now, the only part that complicates that, of course, they just acquired Falk in the past year, extended him to a 7-year extension right away, gave him a full no-trade clause, so that's not going to be easy. And many believe that Falk was acquired as kind of like a backup piece in case they lost Pietrangelo due to free agency, which many expected was a high risk to happen due to the fact that the Blues had so many other obligations. But moving Falk would not be an easy task at all. Some question if he could be made available as well to Seattle in the expansion draft, but having a full no-trade clause could force them to protect him as well. So that certainly complicates things. When you look at teams like St. Louis when it comes to the expansion draft and whatnot, they're going to be a team that's really going to be at risk to lose a solid player. I mean, they also have Vince Dunn, who they need to re-sign as well. So they're bound to lose a pretty solid blue liner, especially if they re-sign their captain. But they could sign him just to a 1-year contract. Wouldn't be shocking if he was forced to take a 1-year deal. Obviously, as I mentioned, teams are going to be very tight. Not too many teams out there are going to be throwing around to big money deals, long-term contracts. So obviously, in the ones who would, likely would be the weaker teams that he may not have interest in. So I think there's a pretty good chance he can work out a deal to stay, but it is going to cause some cap casualties. And as I mentioned before, the main players who are going to be likely casualties in that situation would be Alex Steen as a potential buyout or trade candidate. I think Tyler Bozak with 1 year left at $5 million is a potential candidate as well. I don't think the Blues would really ideally want to move him off the lineup, but at the same time, he's one of the few players that would be in that category. And like I said, I'd be surprised if they keep both goaltenders as well. I would imagine that Jordan Binnington likely gets an extension this year. And because of Jake Allen's recent better play, wouldn't be shocking if he was moved along to another team. There's definitely a handful of teams that they're looking for goaltending, and he could be, a potential good target for them as well. And if not, maybe they hang on to him, and maybe he could go to Seattle as well, because they're going to be looking for goaltending when it comes to the expansion draft. So clearly the Blues are going to have some tough decisions to make. I don't think moving out Falk is really an option when it comes to trying to keep their captain. They're going to have to go a different direction. I can't see Falk waiving his no trade within 1 year of that contract after just arriving and signing a big time extension. Like I said, they get Vince Dunn, Colton Parayko back there. Like, they're bound to lose a pretty good defenseman if they keep all these guys in the fold longer term when it comes to the expansion draft. So we'll have to wait to be seen, but they're going to have some tough choices to make here once the season is deemed complete. Now, another tidbit I want to take a look at here is a potential Jack Eichel trade. Now, of course, we don't have any firm rumors that they're even shopping on. I know we've talked about before he was frustrated. The Sabres just went through a massive firing. We don't really know how new GM Kevin Adams feels about everything and what kind of moves he could be making. But Kevin Kurz of The Athletic, who covers the Sharks, had a recent article where he kind of mused about the idea of what it could take for San Jose to acquire Eichel should he become available. So for Sabres fans out there, don't think that we're making up trades that saying that Eichel's getting moved, because I don't know that. This is just an article indicating that what could it take for San Jose? Could they be a contender should that ever come to be here sometime in the next year? So Kurz went on to write about the fact that obviously the Sharks have an aging core, especially if you go look at guys like Thornton Marlowe, or you're not all that young anymore. They're likely near the end of their careers. You got Brent Burns is getting up there in age. They could use certainly a young dynamic center like Eichel. There's no doubt about it. He could be the type of player who really helps them resurge and become a top team again after really bottoming out this past year. But what would it take for San Jose to acquire Jack Eichel? The article goes on to talk about here that it could include defenseman Brent Burns due to salary to make the numbers work. Obviously, Brent Burns is almost 35 years old. He's got a big-time contract with a fair bit of term left, and he only has a modified no trade, so that might make things a little bit more easy to move him compared to a guy like Marc-Edouard Vlasic. Kurz goes on to write that Vlasic would be probably their first preference to trade, but barring that Burns would be the next option, and Vlasic has a full no trade, complicating things even further. So if they're unable to move Vlasic, Burns could be included in this kind of deal, as well as possibly some younger assets like defenseman Ryan Merkley, who was their first round pick a couple years ago. I know there's a lot of rumors and talk about him that he comes with a lot of baggage and attitude issues, but from what I can see in his recent trend in the OHL, I think he seems to be finally maturing. His most recent stint with London certainly showed a lot of that seemed to be gone by the wayside, so hopefully it stays that way. He also suggests that maybe they could include a guy like Jonathan Dahlen, who's still a decent-looking prospect, but still farly removed out now from being a draft year, and not quite clear when he's going to make the jump to the NHL. Probably one more year, and maybe a first-round pick. But obviously that might not be attractive enough to the Sabres given Burns' age. I mean, obviously taking on that hefty contract for he's not quite the defenseman he used to be might not be attractive. They might have to take Burns out and put in a guy like Timo Meier. So maybe Meier along with Merkley, Dahlin, maybe a first and second round pick, something to that effect. That might get the job done, but that would be a big price to pay. The Sharks don't have a deep prospect pool. They have a few interesting guys, with Merkley being near the top of that list. I think Ryan Merkley, if he can get his act together and keep his head on straight and get rid of the attitude problems for good, which hopefully he's starting to do, then he could be a top pair defenseman. There's certainly the potential is there. Hard to say if he'll live up to that, because there's certainly, like I said, some other factors at play. But Merkley would be a very interesting prospect for the Sharks to possibly consider trading. But if they can get a guy like Jack Eichel, then that's probably the only scenario that you really consider doing that. But would San Jose be a contender in that situation? I'd love to know what your thoughts are down in the comment section. And Kevin Kurz goes on to write as well that if Burns was not included in a big-time trade for a player of Jack Eichel's caliber, Could he be exposed in the Seattle expansion draft? He's another player with a big contract that does not have a full no-move clause, and if they're not able to move a guy like Marc-Edouard Vlasic, they need to be able to shed one of those big-time blue line contracts between Karlsson, Vlasic, and Burns, with Karlsson being the least likely out of all of them to get traded. So that's another interesting scenario. Could Brent Burns possibly end up in Seattle once the expansion draft comes in 2021? Another interesting thing to think about. Then again, we don't know for sure that the Sabres would consider trading Eichel. We need to get a better pulse on what Kevin Adams' plans are. But if he were to be moved, or if he decided he had enough and wanted to be traded, could San Jose be a landing spot for him? Do they have what it takes to make that kind of trade? If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content. And give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I will catch you next time.